Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm breaking kind of a personal rule here. Those of you who follow my channel know I avoid being inflammatory. I don't curse, I don't slander, and I generally don't get political. But I've noticed something ugly that I just can't keep quiet about anymore. A man named George Santayana once said, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Well, guess what? Some people did not learn and are repeating an ugly chapter in American history. They're just changing the targets a bit. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let's back up a bit. Let's take a look at the past to see what I'm talking about. No, that's a bit too far. Jump ahead a few years. This is human history I'm talking about. The Great London Beer Flood. A bit obscure, but a step in the right direction. No, I'm talking about a part of American history. The Boston Molasses Flood. Yes, right country this time, little closer to the correct date, but let's give it another try. This time not even remotely flood-related. At all. Now, but pandas? Do you even know what history is? Never mind, no more guesses. I'm talking about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Sheesh! Anyway, seriously, the 50s were pretty impressive. Rock and roll, the development of television, and the U.S. was a respected world power. It was a good time to be an American. Well, that is, if you were the right color, and you weren't poor, and, believed in the right faith. Come to think of it, for many it wasn't all that wonderful. Segregation was still a thing, and for those unfamiliar, that meant separate facilities for white people and for minorities. This was true for all non-whites, but the African Americans often got the worst of it. Bathrooms, restaurants, drinking fountains, and even public schools, ever since 1879, were separate. The laws of the time said both sets of schools had to be equally supplied and funded, but anyone who knows how the world works wouldn't believe that steaming pile of manure for 30 seconds. The black schools were often dilapidated, and in at least one case, even condemned and only reopened when they needed a place to keep the minority students separated. One on record did not even have bathrooms in the building, and none had the current textbooks and supplies needed to actually provide an education. Possibly, worst of all, the way these schools were placed, these students would live closer to and have to pass by better-funded white schools on the way to get to their assigned campus. This was just the way things were up until 1954, when the case of Brown versus Board was brought before the courts. It sounds like one case, but the Brown family was only one of 13 represented in this landmark lawsuit, citing that segregation was unfair and denied the students access to the education promised to all Americans. And even if the supposedly separate but equal facilities were in every way even, which they weren't, it would still be a violation, as the act of segregation by itself set a precedent that these students were set apart from the Caucasians and were unfit to learn with them. There was a lot of hemming and hawing on the court side, and it dragged on for months, but in the end, justice prevailed, and an unexpected unanimous decision was reached. Every single justice on the Supreme Court agreed segregation was unfair, and schools were ordered to integrate all the races as soon as possible. Yay! The good guys won! Oppression had been quashed, and happy times were to be had by all, right? And if you believe it was that easy, I've got some valuable swampland in Florida to sell you. This news was not well received by some people, and the response was immediate and ugly. While a few schools did act in good faith and make efforts to obey the ruling, a vast majority took advantage of the lack of an actual deadline for compliance and, as soon as possible, quickly became their excuse to drag their heels and resist, hoping that if they waited, the court's decision would be overturned. And to be fair, they might have had somewhat good reason to think this, because the opposition gathered some pretty powerful people. From big-name lawyers to political bigwigs, people joined the indignant group who insisted that racial purity was of key importance. And this may not surprise many of you, but a big part of this was moral and religious outrage. To them, segregation was what God intended, and it was not the government's place to make such decisions for the people. The governor of Arkansas at the time was so against desegregation, he deployed the National Guard to deny African-American students entry to a school in Little Rock, and this was only brought to a halt when the president himself sent the military to enforce things. A few years later, the governor of Alabama, elected under his segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever policy, came personally to the University of Alabama to stand in the doorway and deny students of the quote-unquote wrong ethnicity. And this was not a purely political battle either. Oh no. This was a long fight drawn out by the common folk as well. White students insulted, spat upon, and assaulted African American students on their way to and in school. Parents and pretty much anyone with enough hate in their hearts to want to oppress people they've never met showed up in hordes to protest. And attacks and even murder were the inevitable result for those of any ethnicity, other Caucasians included, who would dare stand up and try to fight this. A number of schools even shut down entirely, closing their doors rather than allow these students to mingle with their precious, pure offspring, with one parent seemingly unaware of how ironic and completely repugnant this argument sounds, cited that he did not want his children in regular contact with black students because he feared that this would erode the feelings of separation that were right and natural, and that the students would become confused and treat the minorities as equals. Many parents reacted by withdrawing their children from schools that either willingly or were forced to integrate, enrolling them in private schools that did not have to allow equality, with a large number of white families on the lower end of the middle-class spectrum receiving donations and grants from like-minded wealthy individuals to allow their kids to afford these institutions. This is a lot of ugly history, but it happened, and it didn't get better with any speed. Many school zoning borders led to a kind of unofficial segregation of its own, with the vast majority of students in a given school's area of influence being overwhelmingly one color or the other, so the students weren't really much of a mix at all. This led to the advent of busing, or shuttling students from one district to another to attend a school to allow for a greater mixture. This had problems of its own, but I'm running longer than intended already, and I need to wrap this up before I break my artist. Thank you, Keith. I'm sorry, and I appreciate this so much. The reason I'm bringing up this nasty bit of Americana is, well, it's happening again. A group that has suffered lifetimes, generations of bias and repression, has finally gotten a break of good fortune and support from the law, and there's no way to sugarcoat this. A frightening number of people have turned out in force to try and stomp them back down and say, "You don't get to have these rights." It's the same foo-for-all all over again, with many of the exact same arguments and the exact same poisonous thinking. The only thing that's changed this time around is who the bigotry gun is leveled at. We can't change everyone's mind instantly about something they believe so strongly in, but little by little, change will happen. Things are still far from perfect for minorities in this country, but they are so much better than they used to be. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, gay or straight, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, or Pastafarian. If you are an American, you are born with rights granted by the Constitution of this fine nation, and we cannot let people who are used to being the only people who count decide who is people just because they always have. We are a nation built on mingling all walks of life. With a little open-mindedness and understanding, we will make this land a better place for everyone. And for my non-American viewers, I apologize for all this "we" stuff. I'm really trying to reach out to a specific audience with this one. I promise I'll get back to the goofy stuff soon. Be safe, be well, be happy. Good night, YouTube. Have a good one.